Well, good morning, and good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the very first Human Capital Watch of 2020. It's a brand new year and a brand new decade, and I hope you like the brand new intro. We're excited to have you join us, and we're very excited to share with you the hot off the presses results of our flagship report around the C-suite challenge that we do each year. I'm Rebecca Ray, and I have the privilege of leading the Human Capital Center here for the conference board, and very excited to have you. If you're noticing that my voice is a little strange, it's because I'm on the tail end of a cold and I have someone else's voice. But we'll nevertheless soldier through this. A couple of things that we'll be talking about today, and I'll introduce my colleague in just a moment. But we want to talk about, as we do each year, what are the issues of greatest concerns for CEOs and C-suite leaders, both internally and externally. I'd like to know whether or not they think a recession is right around the corner or something that we know all cycles are eventual, but is it imminent or not? And also, what are the most important drivers of external collaboration? Because you'll hear in a moment that this year we're looking at a multi-phased set of research pieces, and one of which is what we're going to talk about today on hot buttons. Another is on external collaboration. And then finally, we'll touch on the perceived barriers to collaboration and how those views might contrast between CEOs and other C-suite leaders. So I hope you'll find it an interesting hour to spend together, and I'm excited to share that with you. I would just mention that you can earn credits either from HRCI, SHRM, or CPE. Remember that if you are looking for CPE credits, you must interact and respond at various points during the webcast today. So I'm here with my colleague, Charles Mitchell. He's the Executive Director of Knowledge Quality and Content, as you can see for the conference board. That's a title that really doesn't convey how intricately involved he is in every piece of research that we do. He makes all of us as researchers better. And in this particular instance, he is the lead writer and has been for a long time on this particular report. So it's a pleasure not only to partner on the report, but also to share the webcast studio/space with him today. So thank you, Chuck.
Thanks, Rebecca. It's great to be here. I think there's going to be some interesting material that we can share today.
I think so too. So let me just also share that, everything in life takes a village. Sometimes it's a bigger village than others, but this is certainly an example of where it does take a village. And we partner with some terrific organizations around the world, as you can see. And a lot of what we're able to share with you is only possible because they reach out to their constituents and members, and we're very appreciative. We've been doing this survey since 1999. I think it was 2017 when we expanded it, not just solely from the CEO view, but also that of the C-suite leaders. And so this way we get some more robust comparisons. This year we had the survey fielded in September and October of last year, and we had a response from over 1,500 CEOs and C-suite leaders. Just over 100 of whom were human capital executives. So our whole theme here was collaborating to compete, which is something we saw come up from last year's research. So we'll be talking about that in the next installation of the report, but today we're going to just touch on it, and we're also going to talk a little bit about some of the hot button issues that are different. So before we show you what they told us, I'd like to know what you think. So we're going to put up a poll question for you, and we're going to ask you just to pick which hot button issue in relation to the external environment do you believe will require your greatest attention in 2020. So if you could just press the button that corresponds with your response, we'll leave it open for a moment. Which hot button issue in relation to the external environment do you believe will require your greatest attention in 2020. Let's give it another few seconds and then we'll close the poll. So it looks as though the top two, which are pretty closed now, would be global political instability coming out on top, and a tie with more intense competition and tight labor market. And then way back in the pack is uncertainty around global trade, although perhaps today's signing of the trade agreement will do something there. and tougher regulatory environment closing out the pack. So I don't know if we have a second poll that talks about internal hot buttons. Is that
Yeah,
in
we
the
do,
mix?
indeed.
Perfect. So then let's close this. And now we're going to ask about which internal organizational environment issues do you believe will require the most attention in 2020? So please take a moment to just select what you think will be the top internal organizational concern you're going to have. And don't be influenced by the seeming popularity of some responses. Things could change. We'll give it another 30 seconds. Then if we could ask the experts in the panel in the booth to close out the poll. Perfect. So attraction and retention of top talent is key. And secondly, it's creating a more innovative culture. And then cost reduction and developing the next generation of leaders as well as data analytics rounds out the pack. So just to remember here, it's attraction and retention of top talent as the winner. All right, thank you so much. If we can go back to the slides, I'd like to show you now what C-suite leaders and CEOs told us.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca.
So, sure.
No, it's interesting to see that the contrast between what our audience thinks and what in the mind of CEOs is really their greatest cause for concern going forward in the new year in 2020. And high on the list for CEOs, obviously, is recession risk. That there's an interesting tale behind this recession risk. It's more in the mind than it is in the grounded in reality at the moment. The conference board's forecasts for the year ahead actually show a slight upturn in global growth. One of the concerns about the recession risk, at least as it plays on the minds of CEOs, is that it starts to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. You start that notion, as you see with the internal environment, also high on that list, and it was high in our poll, is this notion of cost reduction, right? So, the external view is that, there's a concern about recession, start to institute some defenses and risk mitigation against it, and it becomes that self-fulfilling prophecy that's really a concern. The notion around trade, intensifying competition, and political instability very high in the mind of our audiences this morning. But this notion, those three, the trade, the competition, and the political instability, all start to fear into that notion around the recession, that concern around recession risk, right? So it really kind of amplifies that concern. The notion that low on the list, right, are things like tax policy, energy prices, volatility in energy prices. The concern over the recent confrontation with Iran, there was a brief spike, but one of the things about political instability or geopolitical events is that what we've learned at the conference board, at least, is that for the long term, the impact that felt on those sort of geopolitical events are very short term, right, and they don't really impact the long term notion of growth and the overall business environment, right? So, high on the internal environment, on the internal list is, as it was for our group this morning, is concern about talent. It's especially around retention and acquisition. The disruptive technologies, it's really about creating new business models. There is this concern, and as you know, at the dawn of as we are in the digital age, where the increase in artificial intelligence, cognitive learning, machine learning, all of this is very disruptive within organizations. But in order to maintain growth, there's a view among CEOs, and this goes across geographies, that disruptive technologies, i.e., creating new business models, is an essential part. And this notion of creating a more innovative culture, also, again, something that our audience this morning sees as a high list, and there's an agreement there, at least with CEOs in their view, of the importance of creating that innovative culture. And that kind of leads back into the idea of creating new business models, right? You have to be innovative, you have to be expansive, you have to melt those external boundaries. and you have to be able to collaborate externally with even non-traditional partners or even competitors. And that's all part of this, the notion of open innovation and creating an innovative culture within. And that last, the concern on the internal side, this cost controls, is that's one of the issues that starts to become part of that self-fulfilling recession prophecy, if you will, right? That the theory about recession starts to translate into real actions around cost controls. Our audience this morning felt concern around cost controls. That was high on their list of disruptors or concerns going ahead. And low concern now, and I have to remember that these are concerns. These do change year over year as the priorities and the business environment start to evolve, right? So, notions around data privacy. It's interesting when you look at it as a concern, right? It's really about a compliance issue. It's kind of low on the list. But when you flip that question, when you flip that notion behind it, right, it becomes as an engine of growth. Everyone's eyes start to light up, or CEOs start to perk up and listen when you cast it as a competitive data privacy and data privacy protection as a competitive advantage. It flips the scale a little bit, and the attention, it grabs more attention than it does as a risk. Let's put it that way, as a powering of growth. And this notion of gender pay gap, we'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. What is interesting is the notion around healthcare benefits. Especially among U.S. CEOs. And since 2014, when it ranked number one on the list of CEO concerns, internal concerns, this year in the U.S. it's all the way down to 15th. And there's been this trend since 2014 of seeing concern around the healthcare benefit issue start to erode. And I think one of the theories behind that is this notion that there was a lot of concern at when the whole Obamacare Act was being debated and being bought in. There was uncertainty around what the costs were going to be, and I think now that we've lived in an era where there is it's kind of settled. The notion around healthcare benefits is settled. It's become a little bit less of a concern. And again, those priorities shuffle as to what events in the media are portrayed and what events are in the global economic environment and the microeconomic environment. Starts to shift the priorities. So. When we look at the geographic split, it's kind of interesting that again, as you can see, recession risk in all those regions, with the exception of Japan, was number one on the minds of CEOs, and the notion around tight labor markets, very much a concern in the U.S. We see that in mature economies as opposed to emerging markets. Much concern. We're going through a labor market tightness that we haven't seen for decades, and it's certainly weighing now on the minds of CEO executives in many locations. China's interesting. I think as with this concern around the effects of economic sanctions, CEOs in China ranked that 5th. It was no higher than 11th, I think, in any other of the geographic regions, and I think it tells a tale about the U.S.-China trade war, if you will, right? Where the notion around tariffs will come and go. We're seeing if the trade pact signed today, it's going to have an impact on the tariffs. They're kind of temporary. They're almost, they can change overnight in a day. But what doesn't change here for the U.S. and China, at least, is this notion of a technology war and the sanctions that have been placed into on Chinese tech firms. So that's their concern, and it's really having an impact on their worldview for the coming year vis-a-vis CEOs in China. So I think that's an interesting notion. Just another thing to call out, I think, is this notion of the impact in climate change in Latin America. One of the regions, Europe was also there, where it was fairly high on the list, but we'll talk a little bit more about the impact of climate change on business and the C-suite CEO view on that a little bit later. So when we look at the functional cut, there's this group, convergence around the notion of recession risk. it's on the minds of CEOs, CFOs, and human capital executives. Uh, you see number two on the list for human capital executives is tight labor markets, and that makes a lot of sense, having to deal with the uh, with this war for talent and the acquisition and retention of talent in an era of extremely tight labor markets. Very much a concern for human capital executives. Uh, one of the interesting notions too, which they rate much higher than CEOs or CFOs, is this notion of a tighter regulatory environment. So starting to see, globally, the concern around some equality issues. The gig economy, we've seen that in California and the U.S. Regulating those labor markets. Also concern around data privacy, new notions of data confidentiality. That tighter regulatory environment, it was very much on the minds of our human capital executives that responded to our poll. So just to have a little word about the recession and just kind of put it all these responses in an overall business environment context. As I said, the Conference Board, we're predicting about 2.5%, just a little bit below 2.5% globally. It's going to be an uptick over last year. We see a little bit better performance, but a relatively flat growth rate through the end of the decade. So, to put it at 2.5%, that's the environment we're going to be working within. And one of the dangers with that 2% line is marked because when global growth hits around that 2%, although it's obviously not a recession because there is growth, that usually signifies that there are recessions in major economies taking place in that specific point in time in a specific geography. We were very close to that in the previous year. Last 2 years, now we're going to see that concern fade away. So is a recession imminent? Our forecasts say not. Is there a danger that we can think ourselves, a business can think itself into a recession? That's very much a concern. We're seeing the impact of that thought process on business spending, especially here in the U.S. The Federal Reserve saw business spending start to decrease in a year-over-year basis in 2019. So that's the concern, that the theory about recession translates into reality through actions and cost reduction notions, right? So that's the concern. And in the U.S., I think this kind of demonstrates how precarious the growth can be, right? So what we're witnessing now is a divergence that we haven't seen at any point in time since we've been doing these statistics going back more than a decade, and that's the notion of consumer confidence. Consumer confidence is at or near record historic highs. Consumers are spending. Consumers have a lot of confidence going forward, looking forward. But where we see the CEO confidence index is near historic lows. So you have this divergence between a confidence level from the consumer and a low confidence level from CEOs. And in essence, something has to give at some point in time, right? So what we're seeing is a strong consumer confidence numbers, strong consumer spending numbers. And our theory behind this is that the business confidence will, as we start to see some settlement in maybe the trade disputes with China, U.S., and that business confidence level and some of the uncertainty starts to go away, that the business confidence levels will rise, as opposed to the consumer confidence levels coming down to meet the business confidence level, and that's where you would get a tipping point in recession. So, we're all rooting for the consumers to keep spending, and we're rooting for business executives to gain some more confidence in the economy going forward. So just to talk a little bit about the climate change notion. Climate change, it's been part of our survey for the last 4 or 5 years, and it's always been very close to the bottom, the impact of climate change on business. So what we're seeing though now is that we're starting to see a little trend where it's starting to rise. It's becoming more of a concern on behalf of CEOs, and um, it's being driven by Latin America and Europe, but we're also seeing an uptick of concern about this in the United States. So, and this is really driven, it's really driven by consumer demand. It's also being driven by the regulatory notion that non-financial reporting, especially around climate change risk, is being mandated. It certainly is in Europe, and we're starting to see a lot more voluntary reporting on climate risk in the U.S. And just this morning's announcement from Blackstone, BlackRock about starting to judge individual stocks and portfolios based on their sustainability performance is certainly, I think, going to have an impact on that. We'll probably see that concern rise in the coming year.
Well, now, Chuck, thank you for taking us through all of that. I think, I'm struck by your comment about the self-fulfilling prophecy on recession risk. Having come up through financial services when I was a practitioner, I know that the market is an emotional thing. And I wonder, just how much people are aware that the constant drumbeat of saying something negative or the impending nature of a recession hastens its arrival. Do you buy that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think I do, and there's some interesting applied economic research on that notion that indeed that the narrative that's created in social media, the narrative that's created in more traditional media, starts to really have an impact on the psychology of an individual, and it's controlling that narrative that's really important. And if it's a negative narrative, it starts to trend towards a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? One of the I think interesting contrasts on all this is that CEOs are certainly concerned about things like political instability, and the trade issue has an impact on the long-term strategic views of their organizations. For the consumer, it's about do I have a job and how's my income doing? And until those big picture issues start to translate and have an impact on the consumer and their jobs and their incomes, that's when they get concerned. That's when they lose the confidence. So those are the two kind of contrasting issues. But it's very important to be able to realize that the narrative that's being created on social media or the media may not be the correct narrative. It may be, again, become that self-fulfilling prophecy, a race to that bottom.
Well, let us hope that that's not the case. Just like all politics are local, I think, the way you see the world depends on how much money you have in your pocket for discretionary spend and the way in which you want to take care of your family and people you love. So, well, thanks. Let's shift gears a little bit, and let's jump into some of the internal areas where people thought that they were going to be. Actually, this should go back into the poll questions. So we're going to ask the same question, but now from an internal perspective. So do we have the audience question ready to go? My colleagues in this, here we go. Nope, I think we're ahead of the game. So let's do this. Let's go back to the poll question.
Yeah, we did ask right. We did ask. Yeah, we did.
Right, here we go. So, yeah, so this is where we are. So when we share with you the big all-in internal stressors, but when you take a look at internal hot button issues, you can see that it's broken up by 3 regions and 2 countries. And so if you can just take a quick look at that, attracting and retaining talent is number 1 or 2 everywhere. And it is, I think there's a lot of consensus around trying to make sure that we find the talent that we need. And a lot of it is exacerbated by what Chuck shared earlier, which is the tightening labor markets. There are also some factors here. You have a graying population in many of the mature markets. You have an inability to want to move to where the jobs are. You have, wage challenges. So it will be a problem that's with us for some time. A couple of things that are a little different. You can see that developing the next generation of leaders is pretty high in the list as well. Creating a more innovative culture, very high on the list, as Chuck mentioned before. So there's quite a bit of global coalescence around what the challenges are. And I think, at least in part, that's because we are so interconnected these days, and our borders are very porous. So when we look at the hot button issues and we see the breakouts between CEOs, CFOs, and those in the human capital space, clearly attraction and retention of top talent is number one. Notice that an innovative culture is within the top three for all groups, so that's not too surprising. Notice that cost reduction is higher among CFOs. I wouldn't doubt that. But developing the next generation of leaders is higher among CEOs and human capital professionals than it is among CFOs. And I think a couple of other things just to call out is, when you think about what attracts and retains talent, an inclusive culture is one of the main ways in which a company can do that. And that's why I think you see it's higher as a selection among human capital professionals than the others. There's also more a concern or a higher priority, if you will, around workforce diversity. So much of this leads you directly back to attracting and retaining talent. I think there's also a couple of things that I would call out. Notice that providing healthcare benefits for employees is very low, and I think that's because a lot of the noise in the system is sort of shaken out now. So it's not that they aren't braced for healthcare costs to rise each year in many parts of the world, but that it's something that they can then plan for. I remember when healthcare first started to break as a topic when the Affordable Care Act was being considered, and a lot of CEOs with whom we did the follow-up interview said, "We almost don't care what's decided. Just tell us what's decided so that we can address it." So I think that's where folks are. Anything to add on this?
Yeah, I mean, I
Chuck?
think that's an interesting point. Is that what we see through the course of all the survey is it's concern. What creates the issue and what creates the concern is the notion of uncertainty around any particular issue, and it seems that organizations and CEOs can deal with a regulation or a law, even if it's viewed in their view as a bad law or a bad regulation. But once it's out, once it's there, you start to develop the strategies to take advantage of it or mitigate the risks that it creates. It's the uncertainty part, and that really creates the problem and throws the proverbial monkey wrench into any kind of strategic plan, of a horizon of 1 to 3 years or 5 years. So yeah, it's this notion around uncertainty, and I think if you go back to those external issues, it's the uncertainty that surrounds trade. It's the uncertainty around political instability. We all like to deal with, if we know what it is, we can deal with it. And I think that's the mantra that's come out through years of this survey. As soon as there's uncertainty around an issue, it rises in the minds as a concern.
That's right. And the same thing with markets is, they do not like limbo and they do not like uncertainty. So. Well, let's take a look at a topic that's been top of mind in the headlines. And so equal pay for equal work is a hot button issue that's higher among women than it is for men. And, if you truly believe, and much of the data would support, that women are generally speaking paid less for comparable work, that's going to be of more front and center focus perhaps than among men. Although I'd be the first to say that any change that happens in society, you need people who aren't necessarily those who are impacted to lead the charge for what is right or the higher cause. So I'm sure that there are many men who would champion this issue, particularly because they see wives, mothers, sisters, daughters being impacted. But it's just interesting to see the gender split along this particular issue. I think also it's reflective of some of the questions that we ask about board parity, gender parity on boards, rather. And so when we ask if two women on a board seems to be about par, more of the men will feel that there's representation and women will not. And we know from some of the data that it takes a critical mass of women on the board for them to be effective. And also we know from a lot of data from a lot of sources, both ours, McKinsey's, a lot of great stuff out there. It talks about the more diverse a board is, the more financially successful it truly is.
So, Rebecca, let me just jump in. There's a couple of questions that have come up around
Sure.
the survey composition that around industry groups. In this presentation, we're not getting into the industry groups, but I can certainly recommend the report where we certainly have it broken down into three broad sectors: manufacturing, financial services, and non-financial services. There are some interesting differences within those industry groups. For the external environment, though, there was pretty much a convergence across. I know that the manufacturing group had more concern around trade issues than the services groups. And for the internal, I think it pretty much tracks the CEO responses in general. But as I say, that's certainly available in the full report, which is available online at the conference board. Also, there's a question about the gender breaks. About 25% of that 1,500 C-suite response number were females on the gender break. Because of the sample sizes, we can't get into specific gender breaks like on geographies or industries. The sample size just becomes a little too small to be reliable. But yeah, I can tell you that about 25% of the 1,500 sample were females.
Thanks, Chuck. I think one other thing I might call out in terms of a difference among the various industries is that the manufacturing sector, unlike financial services and non-financial services, were much more interested in developing the next generation of leaders, more so than financial services, which had it as a tie for 7, and non-financial services, which had it 4th. And I think that's in part because manufacturing is sometimes a more difficult setting in which to recruit. And so helping people understand the impact of the work done in manufacturing, the ability to change the environment, to change and transform societies, maybe will help in some of the messaging around attracting young people into the manufacturing sector, but much more concerned about it, whereas the other two are not so much.
Good point. Really good point.
Now, Chuck, I know the way we've put this together is instead of having one larger report, we're taking a look at the hot button issues, which we're covering today. We have a section on collaborating to compete, which I'm going to ask you to take us through in a moment. And then we also have a section that's coming up that talks about data privacy. So I wonder if you'd give us sort of a sneak peek at what the next report will cover.
Yeah, sure. So this notion around collaborating to compete. This was the theme of the C-suite challenge this year. We asked about the hot button issues. We asked about their views, CEO C-suite views on the notion of collaboration, and really defining 3 types of collaboration. There's a collaboration with traditional partners, vendors, suppliers, consultants, more, the traditional partners that you would view to collaborate. But what we were really kind of focused on was this collaboration with non-traditional partners, right? The unconventional partners, if you will, complementary sectors, universities, think tanks, startups, government, that notion of non-traditional partners. And then the third part of collaboration that we looked at, and one that is with competitors. And that certainly is one that the vast majority of organizations have yet to dip their toe in the water, although it was about 1/3 of the global responses said that they were experimenting with collaborations around competitors. So those are the definitions that we used in the survey to when we were asking about external collaborations. But as I say, we were really kind of focused on the notion of non-traditional partners, right? With this, and then these are the key findings that came up from the collaboration notion, right? So it's actually that CEOs really see external collaboration with non-traditional partners as a real engine of growth, right? It's about market expansion, and it's about creating perhaps new products and services, right? It's back to that notion of disruptive technologies and creating new business models. And when you look at any organization that's going through that digital transformation on its way to creating new business models, one of the key elements is the blurring of boundaries, right? And that's the blurring of the internal, much more flatter, flexible structure within, and then the blurring of those external boundaries, the melting of the corporate walls, if you will, that really drive into those non-traditional partners. And there are certainly obstacles around those, not the least of it being the internal culture and the internal mindset, or risk-adverse mindset to those external collaborations. We'll look at the barriers here in a few moments, but it's really seen in the eyes of CEOs and the C-suite as a driver of growth, right? This notion of there's some misalignment, or not so much perhaps misalignment as it is differing priorities when it comes to a view of the barriers that are seen by CEOs in the C-suite. Not the least of which is on the CEO view, there's concern about return on investment. It's less of a concern among the C-suite. And one of the, I think, if you will say, red flags that comes up is when we look at the difference in views on the barriers, is that CEOs maybe underestimating the impact or the importance of internal cultural fixes on their ability to execute against an external collaboration strategy. The heavy lift that other members of the C-suite see internally is not as big a concern for the CEOs at this point in time. And yeah, it's our feeling that perhaps that communication up the chain about the heavy lift that's required to become a more collaborative internally that would allow better external collaboration, and maybe that communication is not being said. And the views from CEOs and C-suite executives as to what makes for a collaborative organization, right? It's about shared goals and objectives. It's about communication that's open and transparent. It's about building trust, and it's about having highly engaged teams. A lot of it sounds like the requirements too for what's required for digital transformation as well. So when we look at the contrast between barriers between CEOs and human capital executives, CEOs are very much driven by the strategic growth, as are human capital executives. But what is really interesting is that the human capital view of their chief driver being this exposure to new technologies and the adoption of new technologies, seen on the human capital side as this is the driving force behind it. And you wonder a little bit about what is driving. Rebecca, do you have any thoughts on where that notion comes from? Why on the human capital side that exposure to technology is such a priority, or is seen as a driver?
Sure. So, in the not too distant past, we saw smaller companies being acquired, not so much because of the business, but also because of the quality and the experience and the education of the workers. And, if you're looking at a tight labor market and you're looking at an aggressive strategic plan to compete and win. If you don't have the requisite talent in-house and you are faced with a challenge of spend more money in the open market to get them or upskill your people, those are both longer term and or expensive plays. So if you can partner with folks who have the kinds of skills and experience and partner with them to get some joint venture done or something along those lines, you are in essence um, uh, speeding past the time it will take to upskill your own people if you were to do it on your own. And this is one way to help with that process. So I think the exposure to, the ability to learn from these external partners who might not have been thought of in the past, but now as seen as a great way to move your own people forward. I think when carefully managed and done well, we'll see more and more of this as time goes on. I mean, Chuck, do you think that has some
No,
validity?
I mean, no, you absolutely, and I think it's interesting that again, from the human capital view on just the importance of and impact of changing the culture internally, to be more outward looking, to be more to show more exposure. It's the cultural transformation aspect of it is seen very much as a driver from the human capital side, less so from the CEO side. And I think there's some really interesting and great company examples uh, of organizations that have gone outside to bring in that entrepreneurial culture that's needed. And the Development Bank of Singapore, I think, is a really good example of state banking culture in a more conservative national culture. And how do we get our organization, our internal employees, to be more entrepreneurial? And their solution was indeed to partner with startups and to expose the staff to that kind of thinking, the agile methodologies that you see in startups, and try and import that back into their banking culture with some really good success on the retail banking side. So it's interesting to see that the drivers, the human capital drivers, are much more focused on bringing that culture in and transforming that culture internally. That's a big point.
Yeah, no, it's among the top three among the human capital respondents. And I think if you introduce, like any other ecosystem, if you introduce new thinking, new technology, new approaches, new ways of solving problems, you are going to transform you are going to transform the culture if you can get enough people in there to get momentum. I think it's always interesting that cost reduction or cost savings is usually not a piece of this puzzle. They're really looking for, you can't cut your way in expenses to success, right? So this is really about growth, and it's about thinking differently about things. That's for sure.
Yeah, it's very much you see that notion of a growth orientation. We've seen it in various surveys through the years. When you asked about digital transformation, for example, the notion of cost reduction was pretty low down the list. These innovative ideas are all seen as growth drivers, and that's and concerning coupling that with the fear of a recession risk. Everyone's looking for growth, and they're seeing that these strategies and programs can really start to drive growth, and that's what it's about. It's a growth orientation. You're right.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not that dissimilar when we ask the question around why are you looking at contingent workers? It's not around cost containment. It's around getting the requisite
Right.
skills. So
And which is also seen as a driver, more so on the human capital side, is getting the talent that is lacking. Into the organization or their specific skills, and that brings you back to this whole notion of, I think of not being able to hire, and especially in tight labor markets, not being able to hire your way out of a digital talent shortage, right? I mean, this is an era now where digital skills are outdated within 18 months. So if you're going out in the marketplace, you're hiring for a specific skill, that skill is outdated fairly quickly. And what we've seen obviously among our members, and some high-profile cases like Amazon, right, are uh, uh, evolving your existing talent base, actually committing the resources and time to upskilling the existing labor force, because going out into the marketplace in a tight labor market for skills that are quickly outdated may not be a winning strategy in this day and age.
No, I think that's exactly right. All right, so let's ask another poll. Before I do, Chuck, I don't think there are any other additional questions that have come in, so
Right.
let's go with the poll. So what's the top barrier to implementing external, non-traditional partners and/or competitors for collaboration? So if you take a moment, what are the top barriers? Pick one. What's the top barrier to implementing external collaboration among non-traditional partners or competitors? Give another 30 seconds. Fifteen seconds. All right, we'll go ahead and close the poll. So among people who are on this webcast today, it's a risk-averse organizational mindset, followed not terribly closely, but an unwillingness of management to give up current business model and products. Loss of IP is a little further back in the pack. Too many resources consumed relative to the return, and a lack of internal structure to collaborate effectively with external partners rounds out the remaining top choices. So let's just see whether or not risk-averse organizational mindset came up early. So let's bring up the next slide. We'll ask our experts in the panel room to put it up. There we go. So here's what the HR executives in our poll said was a lack of internal structure to collaborate and difficulty in identifying the right partners. And you can see that those are 1 and 2 for CEOs as well. So not too much difference there. But notice where HR folks see much more of a challenge. So it's the risk-averse organizational mindset, and then they see that as a higher level barrier than do CEOs, resistance from business units, and the unwillingness of management to give up current business models. So what you folks have just shared with us is very much in keeping with what the broader pool shared as well. Notice also that the difference between HR executives and CEOs can be seen in these two as well. The loss of IP is of much greater concern to CEOs. And I think when we peel back more of the details on today's agreement with China, we're going to see that there's some loss of IP concerns is there as well. And also difficulties in overcoming cultural differences, much higher for CEOs on this poll question than it was for HR executives. Chuck, anything to pull out from that slide before I
No,
move
I think
along?
it's interesting that our audience today is very much in line with the respondents from our HR executives in the global survey. This notion of those cultural issues around, if you will, the resistance to change within the organizations, this goes back to that notion of is there an underestimation on behalf of CEOs of the heavy internal cultural lift and the kind of behaviors that CEOs will need to model in order to be able to get to a point where you can introduce an effective external collaboration strategy with non-traditional partners. It's incenting the behaviors. It's the risk-averse mindset. CEOs don't see that as an issue, and that could be the very first stop barrier that one hits in trying to execute a strategy like that. I just think that this creates a lot of room for discussion within organizations to make sure that those alignments and that message and the clear heavy lift that's going to be required is communicated up, and then the resources are allocated. And I think there's also another interesting notion about CEOs are obviously under that pressure on a daily basis, the short-term returns, the quarterly return notion. So they're concerned about return on investment or allocation of resources vis-a-vis return for an external collaboration. There's a more immediate expectation of benefit. Yet we know that, and the C-suite and certainly HR executives know that it takes more time to build those relationships, to have those external partnerships start to pay dividends. You have to build, and you have to build the internal culture. And there's that issue that they see. They see that it's a longer term play, perhaps, and maybe there's something that can be done to better manage the expectations of a fast ROI on these things.
Right. So, changing the culture runs headlong into wins, and because changing a culture takes a good 3 years, and that's tough when you're trying to have a nimble, agile workforce that's poised to, be customer focused and a variety of other things. And so the culture does take, it's probably the most important thing you can do. It takes the most time, it's the biggest lift. So a couple of things on this last slide here. We asked CEOs whether or not they thought that trust in their own company's ability to be responsible and ethical in the use of data would be a competitive advantage. Here's the good news. You can see the high 70s percentage of people who responded that they thought it was, which is great. I hope that drives the right behavior. And the second thing is they wanted to know how much harder, if they agreed rather, that it would be harder to have employees participate in sharing their data with the company. And people believe that that is only going to become more and more a part of the landscape. So in an era of transparency and fluidity and transformative culture, these might be a couple of the things that will be top of mind for our respondents. So Chuck, with that, I just, if there's any last questions before we remind folks of, our next Human Capital Watch, which will be in February. It's a really interesting report on the intersection between employee engagement, experience, and inclusion. But is there anything coming up for you on questions, Chuck, that we need to handle in these last 2 minutes?
No, not at this point in time. No, I think
okay.
They're all good.
All right. Well, then just a couple of things. I would encourage you to, all of our listeners, to take advantage of our podcast series. We've got some really terrific people who've graciously spent some time with us. We also have wonderful book discussions. We have an exclusive partnership with Harvard on some of their brand new books, and we have some really great thinkers and writers who come and share insights with us. I hope you'll take advantage of those. Great when you're commuting or out jogging, so be sure you keep those top of mind as well. I also want to reiterate that we very much would love your feedback. If there are things we can do to be better, or if there are topics that you think are just terrific, that's great. And what's completely missing from this deck, and is my own fault for not putting it in, is we just launched our benchmarking platform, which will go out in exactly 7 minutes. So I would encourage all of you to take advantage of this. If you're a member of the Human Capital Center, all 10 categories across the breadth of human capital are available to you. And for whatever council you may belong to, if you're not a member of the Human Capital Center, you have a survey category, whether that's strategic HR, or talent acquisition, or HR tech and ops, learning and development, leadership development, coaching, diversity, inclusion. You have a survey that's included in your membership as a council member. So I would encourage you to visit our website. You cannot miss the banner, which is larger than life. Go learn more about it. We're trying to put together something that is, actually we've built it with and for our members. It's not that there isn't some great benchmarking opportunities out there, but no one has the ability to go through all 10 categories and gain additional insights on this self-service benchmarking platform. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that. Join us. It'll be open later today. It'll be open through mid-February, and then we're going to honor the best and brightest among us at our various conferences and webcasts throughout the year. So with that, I'll leave and say thank you for joining us. And thank you, Chuck, not only for joining me today, but also for the great work that you've done on this report this year as well. Take care, everyone, and thank you all so much for joining us. Bye-bye now.